Hey, scribes. Happy Thursday. I feel like Rakim, y'all. I feel like it has been a long time. I shouldn't have left you without a dope rhyme to step to. Um, I'm not even going to offer excuses. What I am going to do, though, is get right into it and talk about what we're the focus of today's class. So, the focus of today's class is really about using memory to tell a story. And in this particular case, we're going to be talking about to write an essay, to write a personal essay. Hey, Mona, welcome. Um, so as you may know, because I did post it here in the group, is that I did this essay for Bustle, and it was about how I grew up in the 80s during the Central Park 5Ks, now known as the Exonerated 5, because they have been exonerated for many years. But I feel like this story, When They See Us, and even the documentary that came out a few years ago, really helps to put them back into the limelight and really put our criminal justice system, front and center. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So before we get into all of that, let me just remind the newbies. Hey, Jean, welcome. What's up, Ethan? What you doing in this group? Ethan, I think Ethan is spying on me. Mona says, hi, my niece. Hi. So for the newbies who may be joining us later on or during the replay, I am Taiia Smart Young. I'm the face behind this page, and my goal, my passion in life is to teach newbies to create influence, impact, and income. And if I'm speaking kind of funny, it's because I have my new aligners in and they are killing me. They are hurting so badly, but I'm trying to get these teeth straight. So we're just going to power through. So like I said, everybody is talking about Ava DuVernay's When They See Us. If you have not seen the limited series, I encourage you to do so. If you haven't seen it, no shade, no tea, no judgment. It is difficult to watch. It's important to watch, I think, and it's important for us to have conversations with our families about what to do when stopped by police, how to speak, how to move, how to act. And so I was given this opportunity to be a small part of the conversation in terms of just the Central Park 5 case and When They See Us. So I had the screener, y'all. I had the screener like early. And so I was kind of like, I couldn't wait to talk to somebody about it because it was just so moving and so passionate. Tell me in the comments, have you guys seen it and what do you think? And yes, Ethan, I see you laughing at me. In the comments, have you guys seen it? What do you think? If you are from New York City, then I know you can relate. If you grew up during the 80s like I did, then I definitely know you can relate. So quick backstory, let me tell you how I got the assignment for this particular essay. So there was an editor at Bustle who emailed me, and it was like out of the blue, like, hey, there was actually a coworker of hers that I used to work with who recommended me. Shout out to Jada Gomez for this assignment, because she was the one that said, you know what, I think Taiia is old enough to have lived during that time and may have some memories. She went to school in the city, see if she has anything to say. And when the editor hit me up, I automatically had thoughts. Like the Central Park 5 case is kind of like the Trayvon Martin case. It's kind of like, it's one of those things that if you lived in the city or were a person of color and you experience something similar, then it's one of those things that is just not going to leave you. It's going to stay with you. Jean said it was hard to watch the Central Park 5, hard to watch as an older Black male. Good point. Chris says, hey, I haven't seen it yet, but it's on my list. Yes, Chris, you have to check it out. Mona says, I truly relate, currently watching. Yes, if you haven't seen the last episode, to me, 1 and 4 are the hardest to watch, especially because Corey Wise, who was the oldest at the time and tried as an adult, he was 16. The other guys were like 14 and 15. He was 16 and he was tried as an adult, and he spent the most time incarcerated, 13 years, and in adult prisons. So when you watch and see what happens to him, it's truly heartbreaking. Ethan says, I've seen it, I've lived through it, it's super emotional. Absolutely. So you guys are going to understand then when I dig into how I approach the assignment. So whenever I write, it doesn't matter what I'm working on, I always start with a series of notes and just some immediate feelings that I want to write down in terms of whatever the subject is. And so for this one, the first thing that came to my mind was that newspaper headline. So in my house, we used to get the Daily News, and I just remember seeing that word wilding splashed across the daily news. And I was like, what the hell is wilding? Like, we don't say wilding, right? we're going to drop an N. We're going to drop a G off of the end of all of our words. We don't say wilding. And that wasn't really something that we were saying at that time anyway. And then there was this whole confusion where it was like, oh, it was playing off of like Tone Loc and the West Coast. Listen, in 1989, we wasn't really rocking that hard with the West Coast, okay, in New York City. We were all about, it was about 1989, that was self-destruction, that was fight the power. We were rocking with Public Enemy. We were rocking with KRS-One. It was a different kind of vibe. So I never believed that whole story where they were trying to connect the dots to, it was related to that Tone Loc song. Get out of here with that. The other thing that immediately came to mind is, if you live in New York City now, and you're a transplant, then the New York City now and the New York City in the 80s, two different vibes, right? I remember graffiti on the trains. Now you go in New York City, you're not going to see graffiti on the trains. It's just, that was just a moment in time. And then the other thing that really, really stuck with me was that being the mother of an 18-year-old son, knowing that what happened in 1989 could happen in 2019, that was like one of the biggest things that stood out to me in terms of me just writing down some notes in terms of what what immediately struck me. Let me scroll over here and see what you guys are talking about. Let's see. Mona says, I have to agree, it's tough to watch, but I'm getting through it, especially as the mother of a son. Yes, I think that mothers in general are going to relate and have a soft spot in our hearts for this piece and feel a certain kind of way, knowing that someone could look at your baby and your baby could be criminalized. And that's something that I talk about in my essay. Even as young as 8 years old, as young as 10 years old, as young as 11 years old. Let's see. So let me get into these tips. So the first thing I think you should do if you're trying to use your memory to create an essay, and especially if the essay is related to something that's large, like, so my essay was related to growing up in New York City during the Central Park 5 case and how it affected me back then as a teenager and now as an adult. So the first thing that I'm going to say as a tip, and I'm looking at my script over here, is to find out how your story is connected to the larger story. So now my story is really just a small part of what was going on. And it's really my personal experience of being 16 at the time, following this story as a 16-year-old, and just thinking, like, looking at the guys' pictures, like, they look like my cousins. They look like guys I hung out with. They look like guys that I skated with. So that was one of the first things I did in terms of recalling the memories. Just looking back, I went to look back at some of the news stories, and I saw how the story was covered and how from the very beginning they were they weren't even, it wasn't even like, how news is supposed to say alleged rapist. They were just really convicting these guys in the media. So I was thinking about being a teenager during that time and how I reacted to those news stories. And so one of the things that I didn't put in my essay, because I didn't have enough space, was that I attended a media high school. So I was studying journalism in high school, and I cannot remember us discussing this case in high school. And I feel like that in itself was a crime, but probably because my white teachers didn't want to touch it because they felt like, this right here is a sensitive topic and maybe we just leave it alone. So I really felt like they did us a disservice by not giving us the opportunity, one, to, as students, talk about it in a classroom setting, talk about it as future journalists, or even just as students of color, Black and Latino students. We didn't get a chance to talk about it and vent and say how we felt about it at all. And so what I was thinking about was, one of the things was that the script that my mother used to say to me whenever I used to leave the house to hang out with my friends, she used to say the same thing over and over again, like, don't be a leader, don't be a follower, be a leader. Don't draw too much attention to yourself. Don't be loud. You know how you get with your friends and you're cursing and you're loud and you're all over. Don't be like that, because that just draws attention to you. And then, people think a certain way. They see you out with your sneakers and your gold rings or whatever, because I'm talking about the 80s, right? and they want to make certain assumptions about you. So in terms of a tip, that's the first thing I did. I thought about where my story fit inside the larger story, because I was the same age as Corey when Corey was arrested. So I don't share the same gender with those guys, obviously, but I still had a story within the story, because my mother's job was to try to keep me safe in light of this larger situation that was happening. And then what I also thought about too was New York City was really tense during that time. So I had to think about some of the things that were going on in the 80s. Like if you remember Bernard Goetz, that was the white guy, they called him the subway vigilante. He got on a train. Apparently he had been robbed before. He thought these young men who were bothering him was about to rob him, and he shot them. He shot and wounded them. And so that made the city on edge. We also had like Eleanor Bumpurs. I didn't mention this in my essay, but we had Eleanor Bumpurs, who was killed by police officers. She was a mentally ill grandmom, and she was about to be evicted, and she was killed by police officers. We also had Michael Griffith, who was chased to his death. He was his car broke down in the wrong neighborhood meaning, you know, a predominantly white neighborhood. And this angry mob chased him onto the Belt Parkway, and he was killed by a car. So all of those things kind of made the city really tense. And everybody was kind of like, in terms of racial, being on two opposite sides, people were really on their sides. Like, you know, you had the blacks and the Latinos over here, and you have the white folks over here. And it was just so tense. So by the time the Central Park jogger case came around, it was really easy for the city to divide and go into its separate camps. So I just had to think about those things in terms of what was going on during that time. And then, you know what, it's funny, because when I was out and about and I started to tell people about how my story connected to that story, there were people that really connected. Like there was one woman that I bumped into at an event, and she was telling me that she went to school with Yusuf. And so I was like, wow, that's crazy. Like she was in school and she remembers thinking like, no, Yusuf wouldn't do that. Like he's quiet, he's soft-spoken, he's not that kind of guy. So tip number 2, moving on to tip number 2, is to always highlight your perspective when you're writing specifically a personal essay, because 5 people can walk into a party and have 5 different experiences. 5 people can watch Ava DuVernay's When They See Us and come away with 5 different experiences, especially if you've been incarcerated, especially if you've been wrongly accused, especially if you are a person of color, if you are a mom. Everyone's going to come away with the thing that resonates and connects with them the most, right? So your perspective is important. So even though I didn't live in the same building as those guys, I didn't live in Harlem, what I could relate to was being young and feeling free, feeling like youth is like you're invincible when you're young, and feeling like, you know, I have the whole world ahead of me until someone decides that they're going to snatch it from you. And so my point of view and being in terms of my perspective, and one of the things I didn't really talk too much about in the essay was how Black and brown youths at that time, like Spofford Juvenile Detention Center was huge. It was the place where they just dumped our kids. And so I've had cousins who've been through Spofford, and I went to see them, and I remember it being a dark place. And I was so glad when they finally got rid of that place. I think it was like, was it 2011, but maybe it was before then. But just remembering those things, that was part of my perspective. And then 2, my school had gotten metal detectors. I think it was either my freshman year or maybe my sophomore year at school. My school had gotten metal detectors. So it just gave you this sense of that you weren't necessarily safe, because kids started to bring guns to school to either protect themselves or to do damage. And that it was a weird feeling to be 16 years old and to have your book bag go through a metal detector even before you could go upstairs to your first period class. Does anybody who's here from New York City, do you guys remember Spofford? Do you remember what kind of craziness? Hey, Tamika. Hey, Akila. Welcome. If you remember Spofford, then you remember how crazy it was during that time. It was just like, we never even called it like Spofford Juvenile Detention Center. We just called it Spofford. And the name alone, it just gave you this dark and empty kind of feeling, no hope kind of place. Mona has a good point. Drugs were also running rampant. And I did mention that in my piece, Mona, really quickly. I said crack killed my neighbors. Like crack just came in and devastated us. So in New York City, we were really, especially if you weren't living on the east side and didn't have a lot of money, you experienced a lot of dark moments, unfortunately, during that time, during the 80s. So I would say tip number 3, moving on, is really about descriptions, colorful descriptions. And I'm a big fan of descriptions because I think that certain words can really trigger memories. So, and it's like you can say the smallest thing and really put someone in a certain kind of frame of mind. So I referred to New York City at that time as the rotten apple. Right? We all know New York City as the Big Apple, but because of the drugs and because of the crime and because of the violence and the things that were going on, it didn't feel like this bright, shiny apple to me. New York City, even though we have some great sites and some great culture and some great food, at that time, it really felt to me like the rotten apple. And I'll never forget another memory trigger for me was that Mayor Ed Koch at the time, he called the Central Park 5Ks the crime of the century. And it was interesting that he called this case the crime of the century because not too long before this case happened, there was a Black woman who was thrown off of a roof. I believe it was was it in Brooklyn? I can't remember, so don't quote me for not remembering, but a Black woman was raped and thrown off of a roof in Brooklyn. And there was no huge outcry around this particular case. There was no, this is the crime of the century kind of situation happening here. So again, it's speaking to a lot of the division that was going on in the city and just all these memories flooding back to me about things that had happened. And one of the things I mentioned in my story is how the city was divided, right? There was black and white. There were no shades of gray. It was either they didn't do it or team they did that shit. And people who were on team they did that shit were saying these guys need to be castrated. Excuse me, I forgot to turn my phone off, and that's my dad calling me. They were saying these guys needed to be castrated. Remember Trump with that, he spent $80,000 in ads to run in 4 New York City newspapers. And even though he never called these guys by name, he said they should be executed. He wanted the death penalty back. So all of these things are part of tip number 3 in terms of colorful descriptions and how I used certain words, adjectives to really capture the moment. It helps you to think. I said there was a hate cloud over New York City. So you don't really need to say much more than that. You know exactly where I'm coming from and how I'm feeling. And it was pretty specific in terms of, if you're going to write something that's more sweet, the memories are more sweet, you're obviously going to use sweeter language. But I was writing about a really difficult time, so my language wasn't as sweet. And then tip number 4 really circles back to the first tip, which is about tip number 1 was about finding your story inside of the larger story. So tip number 4 is about connecting the dots. And for me, the way that I connected the dots with what happened in 1989 and me being a mother in 2019 of an 18-year-old son is that the case never left my memory. My mother's script never left my memory. It was sad that when they were exonerated and all the charges were vacated and the real rapist came out, there was no huge fanfare the same way that there was when these guys were arrested. So for me, the biggest thing that I needed to connect the dot on was this presumption of criminality, right? So that our Black and brown men, they're looked at as criminals, they're guilty before proving innocent. And then me being the mother of an 18-year-old son, it's like, yo, somebody's looking at my son that way. It really hurts. And so the script that my mother had said to me all those years ago about being a leader and not a follower and not being loud and coming home on time and letting her know who I was hanging out with, those things then became the same part of my script that my husband and I have to say to our son, right? So it's like, nah, we need the first and last names, right? Of the person that you're hanging out with, not just the Instagram handle. It just can't be like, Sweetie, Sweetie 25 on Instagram. Nah, we need her first and last name. Just so that it's a safety mechanism. See, I told you the aligners. It's a safety mechanism. It's a precaution. It's how we keep our kids safe. And even just texting, like text me where you're going, text me when you're coming in, so that we can know, not to keep track of his movements, but really just to help keep him safe. And the biggest thing is that, we learned, don't sign anything, call us. There will be no coerced confessions, because I feel like that was the thing, that even though these guys were convicted without any physical evidence, without any DNA linking them to this rape, that those coerced confessions were what did them in. And even in the documentary, there's a juror that said, that he knew that there wasn't anything connecting them to it, but really he just went with what everyone else said, because they were like, well, they said they did it, so they must have done it, without looking at everything in its totality before casting a vote of that these guys are guilty. So just knowing that people can use your hair, your chain, your sneakers that you're wearing, your address to really weaponize and tell a story about who you are, that really hurts. And so that was the biggest thing for me in terms of connecting the dots, and that I have an 18-year-old son today, and I want to make sure that we keep him safe, and that he knows how to speak and move in the presence of authority and in the presence of officers. And so, it's unfortunately, it's a hard lesson that not just the Exonerated 5, but a hard lesson that a lot of people have to learn because of this piece. When they see us, a lot of people are now getting involved in being up to speed on what's going on with the Innocence Project, because they're finding out that a lot of Black and brown people who have been pushed into forced confessions, they were kids at the time, and then they spent all this time in jail, and they finally got exonerated, and it's like you've lost all of your life. So just to recap really quickly on the different tips that you can use to recall memory for an essay, and in this case, I used it to recall memories for the essay that I wrote about growing up during the Central Park jogger case and how it affected me then and now. Tip number 1 is really to find out where your story is connected inside of the bigger story. Tip number 2 is to highlight your POV, because like I said, 5 people can watch When They See Us and come away with 5 different perspectives. Number 3 is to use colorful descriptions. The rotten apple versus the big apple. You know exactly the sentiment that I'm going for if I say it's the rotten apple. Tip number 4 is really about connecting the dots and finding a way to make sure that you're linking what happened to you or your experience to the larger story. So I was telling you about how I connected it to being a mother of an 18-year-old son in 2019, and knowing that something terrible can still happen to our young men and our young women today. I've done a lot of talking. Let me see what you guys are talking about in the comments over here. Jean was saying, yes. Hey, Carla. Jean was saying, yes, crack babies all over. Yeah, like that was a serious time for us. And Ethan said Yusuf Hawkins. Yes, Yusuf Hawkins, and I think Michael Griffith happens around the same time. So we had kind of all these things that were happening back to back to back. And it was just, it just made it really difficult for us. And it made it really hard to just be in the city. So let's see. Hey, Vonda, y'all coming in at the very end, but I feel special, and I'm welcoming y'all, and y'all just gonna be, you know what? You just on time for next week. That's all. You ain't late. You just on time for next week. That's all. So let me see if you guys have any questions about, or just comments, or just feelings that you want to drop into the little comment box and let me know what's going on. Please do. And as you know, as always, I do come back later on to answer any questions or hang out with you guys in the comments to see if you didn't catch it live and you caught it on the replay. I will be here. Hey, Vonda. Vonda always supports me. Like, you just have certain people who just give you love no matter what. And it's like, Vonda is one of those people from college. It just, the love just keeps on going. And I'm so appreciative of it. Don't ever think that I'm not. So you guys, I apologize for leaving you for so long. I think I just needed to take the month off and really get my client situation together, get my writing together. But now that I am back, we will have some more great content coming for June and for the summertime. And let's just keep it going. So I will see you here next week, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. And I'm not going to even tell you what we're going to be talking about next week. I like to surprise you. I have my little schedule, but I like to surprise you. So I'll see you guys next week. Take care.